You are listening to Radiant Creators, a collaborative project composed of people whose passion, purpose, and dedication requires forging their own unique path of empowerment and livelihood. A radiant creator isn't making a living, they are living.
This is Radiant Creators, and welcome to the show, Loralee Scaife. Loralee is an amazing individual, has studied Lord of the Rings and Jungian psychology, and wisdom, of course, itself, and has really extracted, I think, a message that to most of us is not hidden in Lord of the Rings, but maybe we never quite dug as deeply into it as we could have, or maybe you're not familiar with Lord of the Rings. Either way, this is going to be a wisdom-packed show. It's Friday, May 29th, 2020, Radiant Creators, and we are talking to Loralee Scaife, and your website is, for those who are listening, it's basically LLastrology-LOTR, as in Lord of the Rings.com. So LLastrology, all one word, -LOTR.com, for those who might want to check that out while we are talking. So, Loralee, how are you doing today? And there's so much that you can possibly, go into, but maybe a brief description of how you came to be really a Lord of the Rings scholar, bringing forth the deeper wisdom from those books to people.
Well, thank you, Craig, for inviting me on Radiant Creators. I'm really excited to talk to you about this, my favorite thing. And really, my journey with Lord of the Rings didn't begin until after seeing Fellowship of the Ring in theaters in December 2001. Prior to that, I barely knew Tolkien. I thought, he was a well-known children's writer of children's stories. And but when I saw the film, I was absolutely stunned by the psychological depth of the whole story. And right then and there, I thought, this is the myth for our time. Because of the depth and because of the complexity of the characters, and also because of the time that it appeared on the scene. It was so remarkable that after only 2 months after 9/11, the event that changed the world, of course, everything was in chaos. There was, people were trying to figure out what the heck is going on in the world. Why did this happen? And one of the other things that really struck me about Fellowship of the Ring was the way evil and the shadow was depicted. Prior to seeing the films, I had spent the past, or the 20 years, I should say, before that, really immersed in the study of astrology, mythology, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and various related subjects. And I had become very interested in the 1990s in the nature of evil. And this was a consequence of a number of things that kind of happened, a series of things, horrific events that happened in the world, and specifically where I happened to be living at the time, which was San Diego, California. And there were, among other school shootings and snipers and this and that, there was a whole lot of things that kind of happened in a series of events over a short period of time. But the things that really got me was a number of abduction and rape cases, abduction and rape of children, abduction, rape, and murder of children. And of course, that also was the time when there was information coming out about satanic ritual abuse and all of that sort of thing. So having looked already into the Jungian perspective on the shadow and how that operates in the personal psyche, after these events, I began to pay more attention to what was happening in the outer world and looking at, what is this thing that can turn people into something that would rape and murder a child. So I was very much looking at evil. And when I saw Fellowship of the Ring, I thought, wow, this Tolkien guy and Peter Jackson really nailed it, really depicted evil in a way that I felt was very important and that helped understand what evil is all about, because one of my primary motivations in doing the series was to bring a more sophisticated understanding of evil in our world and in our time, because it's going on all over the place. And without a more sophisticated psychological understanding of evil, how can we deal with it? We need to have more information. We need to study these things. And I felt that the way evil was portrayed in Lord of the Rings really fit in to this whole picture, both as an inner dynamic, but as a way to understand the things that are going on in our world today. So that's kind of the nutshell version.
And something I thought of while you were describing all that is Tolkien did write Lord of the Rings, or began to scribble that in a notepad during World War I when he was a soldier. Yeah. And I think that now there is a place and a time where he was really, I think, seeing evil in so much of humanity. And I think that when we truly see evil like you have, and you experience that, and we'll go into this, we'll touch on this a bit later for sure, is that it is a wound, and it changes the rest of your life. Once you've seen it, it changes you. And so, but what do we do with that wound? And I think that Tolkien had that wound of seeing and experiencing evil there in the trenches of World War I, like few people do. And then he used that pain of having seen evil to begin creating Lord of the Rings. And he didn't fall prey to, I believe it was Goethe, he said that, the problem with humans is that they're machines. And he said, in World War I, we just had machines, these armies of machines fighting each other, And so, Tolkien I admire because he was wounded, and that wound, that Chiron, you might say, he used it, where I think sometimes when individuals, or maybe too often than not, when they experience evil, that wound is something that they can't ever use constructively. And that's something I definitely want to, help people with in talking to you. And this is only, of course, going to be a brief intro, but definitely I hope that we can help people who have recently experienced evil, who are waking up to it in the world, use that as a powerful wound that they can create powerful things from, that are positive, life-giving.
Yeah. Well, and knowledge and wisdom is power. That's the power that we have as intelligent, conscious humans. We can always seek knowledge, wisdom, and truth if we choose.
If we choose. And I'll have to remember that as we go on through some topics. So I'll kind of make
go ahead. Another thing
yes.
about Tolkien, and again another aspect of the whole picture here with Lord of the Rings and where it came from and why. The really remarkable part about Tolkien, as he is there, sitting in the trenches with who knows what, bombs going off all over the place, his friends and cohorts being, blown up. I think most of the people, his colleagues, people that he knew, were killed in that terrible war. And so he had his little notebook with him there in the trenches and began to connect in the imaginal world with this epic tale about a ring and power and, thousands of years of history. And he himself said that he didn't feel that he was making it up. He felt that the story was already there and he was simply discovering it. And it came to him through his study of languages. So he was a linguist, an etymologist, a professor of literature, and an esteemed um, academic of his time. And he spoke 35 languages. So he was an expert in the ancient Northern European languages, Anglo-Saxon, and all those older languages of Northern Europe. And it was the sounds of the language, the way the languages spoke to him on in his imagination that revealed the story to him, which I think is pretty stunning.
And it goes to show how knowing multiple languages really does expand the mind. I don't. I only know a little bit of Spanish conversationally, and I've kind of forgotten a lot of it. But still, to know several languages, it seems like the more languages you know, the more really you have the ability to articulate yourself. And I know that it can be a terrible frustration for some people who can't articulate, they can't write what they feel. And I think sometimes it can take knowledge of more than one language to do so. So when he created these races that had their own languages, that's really deep, because if it was not for the Elven language that he created, how would we know the Elven race? Or you could say races in Lord of the Rings. You wouldn't know them if it wasn't for their language. And the dwarves. I love the truck drivers. I love Gimli. And Gimli reminds me so much of in the Dwarven language. It reminds me so much of Iron John.
Ah, yes.
Isn't Gimli kind of like Iron John? His character just reminds me of that slightly. It's this just brawny, tough man of the mountain, that kind of helps the very metrosexual Legolas.
It's again another profound differentiation that Tolkien makes in the story, the comparison between particularly Gimli and Legolas, because they're so opposite. But it does provide an image of the different types of masculinity. So I call it the Gimli type would be the rugged masculinity, the more physical, working man, the rodeo riders, the motorcycle riders, the miners, and people, even farmers, people who do the hard physical work. And then there's the more refined masculinity depicted by Legolas and the elves. That's more the academic, the thinking types, the philosophers, the professors, the people who wear the suits and do the higher level brain stuff. And it's not that one's good and the other isn't. It's that these are two aspects, two manifestations of the masculine principle, and it's important that they both be honored in what they are. And the relationship between Gimli and Legolas in the story is also very powerful, because it's like this union of the opposites, that these two very different aspects of the masculine principle can come together, can overcome their, ancient hatred of each other and fear of each other, and come together to deal with an enemy that's coming for them all. And I think this is a message to the men of the West right now, that sometimes there is that negative projection back and forth, that the hardworking, rugged, masculine men find the more refined academic types as being, wimpy and not in touch with the masculine, whereas the more refined types look down their nose at the working type men. So I think right off the bat, this is something for men, well, and women, to understand that there are different manifestations of this masculine principle, and it's very helpful to think of how those can be balanced both within individual men, but also in the culture, because we need everyone, elves, dwarves, hobbits, and men to be coming together now and overcoming whatever internecine little conflicts might be there fomenting, to realize that there is an enemy coming for all of us. And we can't be squabbling amongst ourselves over stupid things.
It's absolutely true. And I think, Legolas and Gimli, they're a great message for us, like you're saying, because if you think about our states, like here in America, you have the rural aspect of the state, then you have the city aspect of the state, and they could both use a bit of wisdom from one another, because that's an unfortunate reality we have in our country right now, is that there's the cities where you have your population density, then you have your rural part of the state, and they don't tend to get along. They have a lot of ancient animosity, a lot of mistrust, and oftentimes for good reason. But with that said, there at Helm's Deep, when I forget the exact line Gimli said, like, I never thought I'd be standing here with an elf, and Legolas says, how about a friend? And you go, we could use that in our country. That would help us right now. Oh, if we could be friends, that would work so much better right now than adversaries to an extreme. And with Tolkien, just going back to that, when he was in his foxhole or in his ditch, probably in his trench, hiding during World War I, waiting for the next attack to come or to create and run into. Two movies that come to mind is 1917 that just came out. And then, of course, also the documentary They Shall Not Grow Old about World War I. Now, they're both movies. They're both Hollywood. They got a little bit of goofiness mixed in them, of course. But if one was to watch 1917 and the documentary They Shall Not Grow Old, they're new and they're somewhat relevant. And they show the nameless death that took place that he was in the midst of. Like, I've heard estimates that at the rate that they're found, and to some extent deliberately looked for, it will take another 1,000 years to find all the bodies of World War I and II.
Oh, God.
And so basically, we can say we never will. And so many died nameless. So many died with no great fanfare. They didn't say anything cool before they died. They just died. And those two, that movie and then that documentary, they really, I think, to a little bit of an extent, they really do get that across. Just the pointless, nameless death, So, and you mentioned that Tolkien said he felt that he was more uncovering it.
A story that was already there.
That was already there, and it's something that I think people feel that are close to the books. I even think about Led Zeppelin and how they put some Tolkien references, some Lord of the Rings references in their music.
They did. Yeah, they did.
And I believe it's real, and I can't explain it. But when you read Lord of the Rings, when you watch the movies, there's just something about it. You just get this feeling like, and maybe it's just because the archetypes exist, because the story is real, because the story is ancient. It's a retelling of ancient myth. Maybe that's why, but there's just this feeling you get, this is real. I know this is real.
I agree. I think it is real. in the deepest possible way. And this is what distinguishes myth, something that is a myth with a capital M, and a good story. There's lots of good stories around. There's lots of movies. There's lots of allegories, and Tolkien really emphasized over and over that his work was not allegory. And an allegory would be something like, I think of maybe The Matrix, or, films that are dealing with something and saying, look, here's what might be going on. This is bad. We don't want this kind of thing. But a myth is something that comes right from the soul. In fact, it has been written, I don't know by who, but the saying is that myth is the record of the soul of a people. And Jean Houston said that myth is the DNA of a culture. So my sense about it is that something that is mythic, that contains archetypes that resonate with the soul of a people who come from the ground, if you will, where the story is brought forth. So for Tolkien, he said that he wanted to bring to the British a myth of their own. So it was something that came right up from the ground, from the land, really. So our ancestors are born on the land where these stories came forth. They're a part of the land, and they are in our bones, in our DNA, these images and these stories. So when Tolkien said that he felt he was discovering something that was already there, it's like a great dream. And both Jung and Campbell spoke about how myth is to a culture what dreams are to the individual. And that is what really moved me to carry on with this project, because I felt so strongly that the images and the characters were within all of us as men and women of the West, the culture of the West that grew out of the land, the Arctic homeland, that it's something in there already, and it gets awakened, it gets stirred and awakened and brought forth into the imagination by stories like Lord of the Rings. And then if it is a myth for our time, then there should be resonance with what's going on in the world now. And so that's what I tried to do in my series, was to say, okay, here's this story. We're confronting a foe that is evil. So what is that? What is that thing? Where did it come from? And what are the internal resources that we have as a culture to stand up to that, to first recognize it, to know that there is evil out there and it's coming for us. So how do we bring forth within each of us as individuals, but also as a culture, these archetypes that will resonate in the culture and begin to open up the possibility for each of us as men and women to find this, let's say, our elvishness and rise to our greatness by studying things like this, by studying things like Lord of the Rings.
Yes, and it seems like myths really need to evolve through time, like Joseph Campbell said. And I've always thought of it as like our myths that belong to us, they're in our bone marrow.
Yeah.
and we don't want to overlook that, because if we get in there, get to know your own myth, get to know your own bone marrow, and you will find that, wow, there's stories in there, and there's ancient wisdom, and also there's ancient trauma. And I think
Yes.
it's really something that Tolkien, he was in the midst of the earth, probably in a trench, most definitely, in the earth during a war where he received that wound. He looked into the eye of Sauron, and then
Yeah.
he created something from it. So it's almost like, yes,
Yeah.
this literally comes from a person who was at war, hiding in the earth from the land. This myth evolved. It came. It's almost like they dug a trench and the myth came out.
Yeah. You almost could say that. Yeah.
Yes.
That it
So,
is buried in the ground. It's buried in our bodies.
yes.
These ancient wounds, this trauma that is so deep in the unconscious that we don't access it in our day-to-day life. And I think part of the reason why we are in the situation we're in now is because not only is it difficult and painful to do that deep psychological work, but it's also, we're um, afflicted with forces in the world that want to keep us away from digging down into the deep psyche and working on the personal shadow. See, just coming back to the language issue. I mean, look at how, no, much less speaking a number of languages. Most people can barely speak the language that is their language they're born with. Especially now, I'm being an English speaker myself. Just realizing that people aren't communicating anymore. Everything's emojis and abbreviations, and basically we're returning to grunts and uh, utterances that don't make any sense. And without the access to the richness of the language, then we can't communicate the mythic relevance of our culture, because the language, it is the language of a people that speaks the myth. So if the language is diminished, then the capacity to speak the myth is lost. We lose that richness. Even just reading Tolkien, the richness of his language.
And it's good to do, especially in this time, because, yes, when you read Tolkien, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, you go, whoa, this is a different way of speaking. So it's a little bit foreign. It's kind of like reading one of my favorite books, Last of the Mohicans. You go, wow, this is different, And I would say that, yes, people really are not able to think past the depth of their own vocabulary, because
That's right.
and I think it's a terrible frustration for many. So I know myself, I'm always working at, gaining a greater vocabulary, kind of fall in love with language, with words. And I look at, oh gosh, I forget the date on it. It might be like 1920, or gosh, it might be 1900. I forget exactly the date of it. I'd have to hop up on the shelf and look at it, but I have an old dictionary. And the thing is that it's huge. It must be like 8 or 9 inches thick, and it's just huge book.
Yeah.
And then the beginning of it gets into, what is verb, adverb, how do you form sentences? So it gets into all that. And this thing was a work of art. It's like old encyclopedias. Everyone should have some old encyclopedias on their shelves, Oftentimes you can find them at like Goodwill or something for only a couple dollars. And it's like, wow, this thing was a journey. And so, yes, we do need to be able to articulate ourselves and to have our language, because if we don't, it's a terrible frustration. And that old dictionary I have, which is just this, epic creation, huge. I look at how many words are in that. And then I have one from like 1990, and it's the size of like, I don't know, a magazine. And so, when you're like,
Oh,
wait a
God,
second,
help us.
something has changed. A tremendous amount of content, and our ability to articulate and to read and to understand and to digest has been, it's just not there anymore. And so, yes, I think that especially reading Tolkien, other works too, but we can focus on Tolkien, of course, it starts to bring you into the history, the roots, the feeling, the passion of your language.
Mhm.
You know,
Well, and one of the other aspects of language that I think is important is the cymatics. That cymatics is the study of how sound and vibration affect matter. And I believe that the sounds themselves of the language resonate in our bodies. And and there is a feeling of when you're resonating with the language, there's a feeling of that resonance, that something shifts in your body and in your psyche through the effect that the sounds have on the body. Do you know about the study of cymatics, Craig?
oh, absolutely. And,
Yeah.
a great way to learn more about that is you can take your best guess at the spelling of cymatics in YouTube and search that. And then you'll see amazing experiments where they put sand on a
Yes.
surface and under that is a speaker, and then different tones create these patterns. And I would invite people, if you think it wasn't real or if it was fake, try it, because I have, and it actually really, it is truth. Then we look at Mr. Emoto, who came up with
Yeah.
the ice crystals, putting different words on
Mhm.
those. And so we are water ultimately. And so
Mhm.
the sound of your voice, of your expression, and the language that you're speaking, it is literally affecting the water, the blood of your body. And then
Yeah.
when you are resonating from that deep place, when you're resonating that, it's the same as two guitars. If you have two guitars on either
Mhm.
side of the room and they're both tuned correctly and you strum one chord or one string, the corresponding guitar will begin to harmonically resonate with it. And
Mhm.
that's an extraordinary thing. So the resonance, the cymatics of our language, of our expression, it literally radiates into the collective consciousness, into and
Mhm.
it's a big deal. So you could think
It is.
about each of the books, each of the stories of Tolkien, and they literally are a cymatic that continues to
Mhm.
resonate. And then the more that read that and see and go deep, like we are here,
Mhm.
go deep. That resonance becomes a greater, and it affects our collective consciousness all the more.
Mhm. And we become aware then of that relationship, that when you make sounds, when you speak, if you begin to attune to the feeling of that, knowing that there is this thing called cymatics, then it starts to link up. And by the way, cymatics is Cymatics, cymatics. And the man who got the ball rolling with this was a man named Hans Jenny. And I believe it was the 1950s or something that he began these experiments. And there's a whole website about this that's absolutely fascinating. And I would encourage anyone who finds this intriguing to check it out, because when you see the patterns that are produced by these experiments, these coherent geometric patterns that just appear when sounds are uh, affecting a medium. It's quite remarkable.
It's an extraordinary thing, definitely. And well, I thought I would set the stage, even though we've already been talking for a while, getting into stuff.
Mhm.
I love the way Wim Hof says "going deep." If you're familiar with him, he's this going deep.
Yeah.
So here's the setting as Loralee Scaife and me, Craig from Radiant Creators, are chatting. I really wanted, my intent was really to help people with the battle of our times because we are in it. And a little bit, if I was to set the stage a little bit, as Loralee and I are talking, I would say we find ourselves at the Black Gate facing the mouth of Sauron. And the mouth of Sauron, it wants you to believe that you are alone and without hope. And it will show you fake evidence that you will succumb to if you don't own your own soul, if you don't know your own bone marrow. And with that said, the battle between good and evil has broken through the veil, and it's happening on earth. It is around us. You're in it. We are in the battle of our time. And Gandalf in Return of the King, he says, we come to it, the great battle of our time. And so, like it or not, you're in it. And it reminds me of little Frodo saying, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had ever happened. And Gandalf, in his wisdom, of course, says, so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what we do with the time that is given us. So that's where we're at. And maybe we're a little Frodo saying, I don't know if I like this idea so much. Well, only way through it is to do it. And it's heroic. So I want people to face it boldly. And with that, I was going to ask, as we enter this battle of our time, there's a line that came to me recently that really struck me. I was going to ask your opinion on it, is how Galadriel says to Mithrandir, which I always liked what the elves call Gandalf, call him Mithrandir. I always thought that sounded so cool. And as they're getting ready to go on their quest, as the Fellowship of the Rings has not quite formed yet, or it is forming, she says, why the halfling? And Gandalf says, I don't know. Saruman believes it is only great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found that it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love. Why Bilbo Baggins? Perhaps it is because I am afraid and he gives me courage. What do you think of that moment between Galadriel and Mithrandir?
Well, I think you've pretty much nailed it there, that the challenge that faces us is not just for wizards and elves to deal with. This requires everyone, elves, dwarves, hobbits, and men. And the interesting thing about the hobbits is that they're depicted as innocent. They're childlike and innocent. Hobbits are the size of children of about 5 years old, human children of about 5 years old. And so they represent that childlike innocence that can be open and filled with awe, and not so much bound to trying to figure things out in an intellectual or rational way. And the hobbits, for the most part, other than Gollum, who once was Sméagol, and even Sméagol, he was just completely possessed by it. It was not. There wasn't a choice there. He wasn't tempted by the ring. It was just, it took him over right away, and there, boom, he became Gollum. So there is a certain vulnerability in the innocent, but the virtue, the love of kin. Frodo left with the ring when he was, told by Gandalf that he had to do it. It's like, here you go, Frodo. I can't do this because I would be tempted. So you must take the ring to Mordor. And so from that moment, Frodo lost his innocence, and that began his hero's journey. And he carried the burden of that for his people. So to preserve the Shire, to ensure that the Shire would remain the Shire, Frodo took the ring out of Bag End.
And it's really something about the notion that only great power can hold evil in check. When we look at the hobbits, they were the only ones who could carry the ring. And there was something about their innocence in that. I mean, because they really were not very formidable in battle. They didn't have the great strength, but yet there was just something always touched me about during Lord of the Rings, where it's just this innocence. And I've always wondered, I ponder, like, could you carry that and the burden? And there's something that strikes me. It's in the Fellowship of the Ring, Book 1, Chapter 2. Where and it's about what the ring does, and it goes, a mortal, Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings, does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues until at last he merely continues until at last very minute is weariness. That might be a misquote there. Sorry about that. But he merely continues until at last every minute is weariness.
Yeah.
And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes, in the end, invisible permanently. And he walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with. But neither strength nor good purpose will last. Sooner or later, the dark power will devour him. And that always struck me, where, that, and that makes me just think about those who held an orb, I forget the name of those, but that looked into the eye of Sauron, that were touched by that evil, that saw it. Because we often look at the Hobbit at the end, Frodo, we might say fails, and but did he really? It's almost like this profound innocence in the book that was able to carry that great evil and not be taken over by it. Really, in truth, they just lasted the longest. And really, Frodo, he didn't really, I think, fail at the end. He just succumbed because everyone would, like all the 9 kings did. So if you carry, there's always been something about that where, how important it is to transmute that wound of having seen evil, of having experienced it, and then create something with it, to where you can become a Gollum, or you can be a Tolkien.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to take one of those paths.
Yeah, I was puzzled for a long time by that, the end scene there, where Frodo is standing on the edge of the volcano, about ready to drop the ring in there, and he just can't do it. And I wondered about that for a long time. Like, why did Tolkien present that? Because it would have been the usual sort of hero story. At the end of the story, he drops the ring in, and, the world is saved and it's all good and happily ever after. But that's not what happened. And I think there's 2 levels of understanding going on there. First of all, I think of Gollum and Sméagol as symbolic of the struggle that's going on within Frodo. So Frodo's the hero on the journey and dealing with Gollum, and Sméagol, that character, is a representation of what Frodo is dealing with in himself, the struggle between ego and shadow. So the Sméagol character is that, or at least what was left in Gollum of his hobbitness, his innocence and kind of hope that maybe he would be freed from the bondage to Gollum. And but Smegel is kind of like the good part, the way we would like to see ourselves, the ego. And an ego, by the way, is not bad. So just to clarify that term, because it gets thrown around a lot, and there seems to be this sense that ego is something bad and that you should not have an ego. And I would say psychologically that is not the case, that the ego is a structure in the psyche that we need because it mediates between conscious and unconscious. We do not want to get rid of the ego, because if you got rid of the ego, you would be psychotic. So the idea, though, is that the ego needs to serve the capital S self. So when people talk about ego as being bad, what they're really saying is that whoever is behaving in an egotistical way is identifying with the capital S self and behaving in ways that are grandiose and infantile. So just to, clarify that term. So Gollum and Smeagol represent the inner struggle going on within Frodo as he carries that burden. And at the very end, on the precipice there, as he is overcome, it's as if he surrenders. And at the point of surrender, then Gollum takes over and grabs the ring. But it is Gollum then who carries it to the pit of Mount Doom. And so I would see that as being like fate, how fate and destiny come in at the right time to do what needs to be done. That in the individual, so in this case Frodo is undergoing this transformation inside himself. And the symbolism of Gollum, or the shadow, let's say, falling into the pit of Mount Doom with the ring, is symbolic of the transformation that takes place within the individual when the shadow is met and dealt with. And it then, Gollum then falls into the pit, and there goes the ring of power. And then Frodo is freed and is able to, he and Sam are rescued from there, but Frodo is mortally wounded. So the wound that he carries from the original Morgul blade when they were fighting the Nazgul, and he was wounded, that wound never really healed. And because of that, Frodo had to go on this long journey and come to the end to do what he was called to do. But then there is this realization, the realization that Frodo had, that his calling has been fulfilled. He completed his journey in life. And that at the very end, when he goes with the elves and Gandalf to the Undying Lands, I see that as being conscious dying. So I think that we all perhaps have the ability to know at some level when it's time for us to leave our body. And perhaps Tolkien was making that reference there, that we fulfill our task here, we follow our vocatio, and when we've completed our task, then we are ready to go. And I don't mean that you commit suicide. I mean that there is a way to know when your job is done. And I just wonder if that is not something important for all of us to be considering um, in these times, that we are all called by the force of our own fate to certainly do our personal work and deal with the realm of our personal lives and rise to our greatness to the best that we can in our personal lives. And then we look out into the world to see where we can help change things in the outer world. But first, it has to be the inner work has to take place first. If we're not the masters and the kings and queens of our own realm, our own self, and our own immediate responsibilities, your family, your kin, your friends, your keeping life going in your own little world, then we're not equipped to deal with anything in the larger world. And so Frodo's journey there and his wounding is it's the typical hero's journey for sure. But the piece at the end, I think, just addresses this idea or the notion of being so tuned in to your own life and your own calling, your own vocatio, that we know when our time has come to completion, when our life is coming to completion. And I think that's worth thinking about, because it certainly does take us beyond the fear of death.
And it also denotes, when you mention, when our quest in life is complete, it also denotes that means we're aware of a purpose that we have.
Exactly.
And I think that's something very essential for people, is that, what is your purpose? And that's usually found in, your excitement, what moves you, what do you want to do? But, also there is that inner work, there is the shadow work. And so, knowing when the end has come also means that, you knew what you were heading towards.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the uncommon life, ultimately, that is aware of that. And I've oftentimes thought too of Frodo and Gollum at the end in their struggle. Could that sort of also point to a dark night of the soul?
Yes.
Because when you have a dark night of the soul, you really do, I guess you could say, surrender, but you also kind of give up in a way. You just go, ugh, and you just go the heck with it. Life is nonsense and I hate it. You know what I mean? And I think that Thomas More wrote that amazing book on Dark Night of the Soul. That was very helpful, where you go, it really, really sucks, but it's kind of one of those things that you probably will go through several during a lifetime, of course. And it's one of the nice things about living a little while is you realize it's kind of like when you drink too much and you don't feel good. Unfortunately, you will live through how terrible you feel. It's the same thing with the Dark Night of the Soul. You go, thankfully this isn't my first one. And I feel like Gollum has won. We're struggling. I don't even care if I win. I don't know. But you really get into that time of ashes. You just go, ugh. And I thought that also represented that Dark Night of the Soul, because they're dirty, they're gritty. You really have kind of given up. You start to live as your shadow for a little while.
Yeah, and that whole business is described in mythology as the descent to the underworld. The descent to the underworld is this dark night of the soul idea, where you hear or feel the call to go down into the deep, into the most wounded aspects of yourself, and sit with the pain and the suffering and the repressed rage, terror, and grief that is down in the deep in just about everybody. So it's both an ancient wound that comes from the ancient times, from the ancestors. It gets passed on down from generation to generation to generation until there is one who becomes awake to this deep wounding and how it has affected our life, individual life and collective life. But the journey to the underworld is an ancient mythic theme. And I think it is depicted primarily in the relationship between Frodo and Sam. And it corresponds to a myth that comes to us from the culture of Sumer about 5,000 years ago. And it is the myth of Inanna and Ereshkigal. And Inanna is the goddess of heaven and earth, and the goddess who brings light, love, and life to the world. And she hears the call of her sister Ereshkigal, who's the goddess of the underworld. And when Ereshkigal invites her to attend the funeral of her husband, now Inanna knows that if she goes to the underworld that she will die, but she is also aware that there is need for renewal on the earth. And so she consciously decides that she will go to the underworld knowing that she will die. And she dresses herself in preparation to descend to the underworld. She dresses herself in wedding garb. So she's literally going to marry death, to merge with death. As she enters the underworld, she must go through 7 gates. And at each of the gates, she is stripped of some of her vestments until finally she appears naked and bowed low before Ereshkigal, who immediately kills her and hangs her body on a meat hook. At this point, Ereshkigal becomes conscious for the first time of her own pain, that out of her rage, jealousy, loneliness, and isolation, she has killed her own sister, who is the bringer of life and love to the world. So she goes into a period of terrible mourning and grieving, and she's moaning and groaning and rolling on the ground in agony over all of this. Meanwhile, the body of Inanna is rotting on the meat hook. Well, now, Inanna, before her descent, had left word with her attendant, Ninshubur, that if she did not return in 3 days, that Ninshubur was to go about the business of finding someone to rescue her. So Ninshubur goes around to all the gods and goddesses, finally comes to Enki, who agrees to help her. And Enki sends into the underworld 2 little mourners. And what the mourners do is simply mourn with Ereshkigal. They validate her pain so that when she cries, they cry. And when she moans, they moan. And they say to her, "Oh, how terrible is your suffering. And oh, how awful is your pain." Well, finally, Ereshkigal is so moved by their compassion and their willingness to be with her in that place that she agrees to give over the body of Inanna to them, whereby the mourners sprinkle Inanna's body with the food and water of life, and she is resurrected and returns to the heavenly realms. But the key here in terms of the relationship between Frodo and Sam is that Sam, and in this myth, Ninshubur, represent that part of the psyche that takes care of life in the real world, while some other part of us is down there in the underworld, sitting with our deepest, repressed, undigested emotional contents, that being primarily rage, terror, and grief. So what is locked up in the underworld very often, because we are not in our culture at this point given the tools to deal with this. In fact, we're not really even told about it, like that there is, we all have this little ball of rage, grief, and terror. And if we don't have the tools or the myths or a way to be with that in order to allow it to transform, then it just gets papered over and stuffed down into the unconscious, and then it motivates our behavior in ways that we don't understand, and it becomes that shadow character like Gollum. The other interesting thing about Gollum and the whole imagery there of the volcano is that's an alchemical image. It's the alchemical process of calcinatio. Calcinatio is the burning, and in alchemy, it's the burning away of the dross. And the dross, it is this glob of unprocessed rage, terror, and grief. So when Frodo and Sam, Sam literally carries Frodo to the mouth of Mount Doom. And that represents that part of the psyche that keeps us going, that goes to work, that pays the bills, that looks after the children, while this other part of ourself is going through this hero's journey, is hanging on the meat hook, and is sitting with this undigested content that is undergoing this kind of calcinatio, this burning away of the dross.
I've never quite thought of the volcano that way, but that's amazing imagery. Mm-hmm. Yes, and definitely that does represent the path. I mean, we do go into that fire, especially in that dark night of the soul.
Too. Gandalf.
Oh,
Gandalf
when
fights the Balrog. Yeah.
Yes.
Another symbol of fire, and falls down in the pit and just wrestles down that Balrog and dies. He succumbs to that. But then he returns Gandalf the White. And in alchemy, what happens is that the black, dark prima materia is placed into an alembic and put in a fire. And what goes on in the alembic is the burning away of the black gunk, the prima materia, and what comes out of the calcinatio process is called the albedo, the whitening. And so there's Gandalf the White. He undergoes that process too.
And something else that Sam reminded me of, Samwise Gamgee, was, because I always look at it, one of the beautiful things with myth, with the deeper wisdom, is that it can have many layers. It can have different, and so on a very physical layer, Samwise Gamgee always reminded me of community and fellowship. He was, I think, something that many people are looking for. They say, maybe I could take my journey on, maybe I could do it, but I feel so alone. I don't have that support. And I've always thought he just represents that beauty of friendship, fellowship, community, family that went along with Frodo. Because without that connection to that, you really are a little too alone sometimes for your journey, even though ultimately in the end you do have to go through that fire yourself. It's nice if you got your fellowship with you.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's why the fellowship formed.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I thought, one thing is, at this time, like we are at the Battle of the Black Gate, and, one thing that we're seeing is, something that comes to mind, is something we all sort of are facing right now, is when we look at the Battle of the Black Gate, so the mouth of Sauron comes out, and you've referenced the mouth of Sauron as really the mainstream media. Kicking out mean pathogens. And, I have a belief that the mainstream media really is the most evil force on this planet. It is the mouth of Sauron. Yeah. And what it wants us to do is believe that we are alone and without hope. Totally alone, without hope. And it meets us in despair. So it kicks out despair. And then it says, you are alone and you are without hope. And that's when Wormtongue comes in and begins to whisper in our ears, and we all have our own personal Anderson Wormtongue, Rachel Wormtongue, Tucker Wormtongue, whatever you want to call it, all the same. and you stop seeing the world through your own eyes, but you see it through
Yes.
them. You only hear them, and you can only communicate through them. And a great word in Lord of the Rings that I've always loved is malice, you know? And so
Yes.
you hear and you see the world through them, and then the only way you can speak to the world really is through malice that they give you. You lose that ability. And so King, I know you know the name off the top of your head, King Theoden, you know,
Yeah.
he had despair. And he was watching the
Yes.
mainstream media. He was watching his kingdom fall apart and all this
Yeah.
suffering. And then he became taken over. And so in our time right now, it does seem that we've got the mouth of Sauron and Wormtongue. The mouth of Sauron, we're at the Black Gates. This is the battle of our time. And and one of the things that struck me is the mouth of Sauron does throw the mithril vest, little mithril armor that Gandalf, I'm sorry, not Gandalf, that Frodo had to Gandalf, and it really seemed like everyone fell for it. Everybody was beginning to lose faith, and that's what they want.
Yes.
So the mouth of Sauron goes, "Oh, I have them in despair. I got them." Well, in the movie, and I forget exactly how it went in the book, so you have to forgive me. It's been a little while. I meant to study that before we talked. But in the movie, Aragorn does not believe that.
No.
And he just doesn't believe it. And that's something we have to get in touch with ourselves because, you know, Aragorn, when he took on his hero's journey, when he faced his fear that he may fail also, he went to the underworld literally, and there he faces the oath breakers, these sort of ghosts, you know, and the King of the Dead, he faces him, and I think it goes something like, "I am Isildur's heir. Fight for me, and I will hold your oaths fulfilled. What say you?" You know, and the King of the Dead smirks and says, "None but the King of Gondor may command me." And then Aragorn holds up Adriel, the remade sword. Anduril, yes, the remade sword of his father was reforged, and he blocks the King of the Dead's blow. And the King of the Dead says, "That line was broken," but Aragorn says, "It was not," and pushes him back.
It has been remade.
It has been remade. And so
that's right.
It seems like as we're standing at the Black Gates, we have to have that faith that all the lies and the despair that they want us to have right now, it's like, wow, don't believe it. Don't succumb to Wormtongue like Theoden did, you know. And it's okay if you have, but it's time to throw Wormtongue down the steps. It's time to cut the mouth of Sauron's head off, which, you know, many people.
And that's the king that does that.
And that is the king, yes.
That means when one rises to one's kingship or queenship, and I'll talk about how Galadriel did that in a minute, but yeah, the ability of Aragorn to behead the mouth of Sauron comes from his passing through his own underworld journey and the despair and the terror and all the rest of it, and claiming the sword and rising to his destiny as Elrond, when he presented the reforged blade, said, you know, put aside the ranger, become who you were meant to be. And from that point, Aragorn took the sword, meaning he claimed his kingship. And that's why it's so important for individual men and women to do their inner work to the point that you're in touch with this higher sacred purpose. And another thing I wanted to say also about this business of the Battle of the Black Gate,
yes,
and connecting back to Tolkien. So Tolkien, there in the trenches, World War I, with the kind of war going on that was a part of that time. But the kind of war that we are victims of right now, they are quiet wars. with silent weapons. So what are those silent weapons? Well, they're the toxic waste that is produced by the mainstream media and their minions, and all the other things, viruses, 5G, excuse me, you name it. These are the silent, or these are the quiet weapons, or the silent weapons for this quiet war. And you see, we're not designed, we people of our time, we expect war to be, atomic bombs and bombs going off and people shooting at each other, right? Because that's the history. It's World War I, World War II, and that was war. And then there were these other little, ongoing little minor wars along the way, but they're shoot 'em up wars. They're big and noisy and obviously extremely destructive. But what catches us unaware now is that we're being attacked by silent weapons. So we don't know we're at war. And because there isn't bombs going off and, people shooting at one another, all over the place. I mean, there is that going on too. But for those of us in the West, the weapons are not bombs and guns. It's this contamination in the environment, toxins of every description, and this mainstream media onslaught of just lies. It's a weapon of mass distraction and of mass deception. And it's shocking how well it works. I mean, why? They don't need bombs anymore. People already are enslaved to the precious in the form of technology. The smartphone is the precious, the thing that no one can give up.
Precious is, I remember when you were talking to David Whitehead, and it's a great series of interviews you guys did. And when I first heard you mention the smartphone as the precious, I remember something that I remember often at powerful moments, and it's that the truth will set you free, but first it'll really piss you off.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, oh man, it's so true. And well, one thing about what you're mentioning, I'll throw vaccines in there, of course, and,
Yes.
and then of course we
Yep.
have people call it AI, which is,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like you almost might call the Eye of Sauron in a way.
Yeah.
And because Rudolf Steiner, he was a great, I'm not even sure how you describe Rudolf Steiner, but he came up, of course, with Waldorf schools, biodynamic
Yes.
farming, and his amazing writings and lectures. And, he spoke of there was two negative forces. There was Ahriman and Lucifer, as he called them. Now, his definitions were very different than what we usually think of. So Ahriman was, you call it the eighth sphere, and it was trying to pull us into despair, basically, into this other world, and that Ahriman wanted to convince us that all is physical. And that AI totally works because you're just a machine. All things are machines. And so there's only the physical. And so ultimately, when there is no soul and there's only the physical, well, you might as well be a sociopath because that's the reality of it. And Steiner said that there would be, at this time we are living right now, I think he died in the early 1920s, I believe. And he said, during this time we're in right now, there would be a reincarnation of the Ahrimanic force. And many Steiner scholars and people who have studied him for much time do believe that reincarnation of this incarnation, just like ultimately Sauron had his reincarnation, you could say, Ahriman would have his reincarnation as AI itself, this dense reality. And then kind of the other negative entity was Lucifer. And the Luciferic principle was basically could be summarized as the New Age movement, where
Mm.
it is delusional. There is no right and wrong. Anything goes. There is no great quest. It's just this sort of, it can also be considered like the love of art, which is beautiful, these principles, but at the same time, too much of a love of art can make you not like reality.
Mm.
So, you have Ahriman saying, be physical, be AI. I will be your AI God. Upload yourself
Mm.
into a computer and you will live forever with me in the dense physical.
Yeah.
And you're precious in your phone. Live through me. I am a machine. The reincarnation of Ahriman ultimately in our time may have been the precious, the cell phone, quite literally. And you have Lucifer saying, just be New Age. Yeah, it's,
Just forget it all.
Just forget it.
Don't worry, be happy.
Only focus on the positive. Don't look at your shadow. Just manifest a Ferrari.
Yeah, right.
And that doesn't
Well,
really
and
work
if
for
you
us.
don't look into the darkness, if you turn away from the darkness, you will become the darkness because it will pursue you and take you over. So we have to learn how to look into the eye of Sauron without becoming possessed by it. That is the work of our time.
And that's the work of our time. And something that came to mind while you were talking was the main Sauron media, with Anderson Wormtongue out there talking. The MSM, it is broadcasting a somatic.
Yeah, it is. Oh, absolutely.
And so that's the thing. When you despair, when it can get you to despair, it can bring you into its own cymatic energy, which really uses lies, preying on our goodness and shame, all these things. It goes, well, you just broadcast you become atoned with its cymatic. And so it's one of the things I'm oftentimes very afraid to look at the mainstream media. Like I really don't, because I go, oh my gosh, there's this quantum entanglement with their cymatic that they're broadcasting, and to see it is to resonate with it. And I go, oh, I just don't want to. And so we have to be very, very careful of that. And well, you mentioned Galadriel, and before we get into her journey, I wanted to mention, as we approach all of this, as people are listening, if you feel a little bit down, realize that, Frodo said, I wish the ring had never come to me. But remember, we also have an inner Gimli. And remember what Gimli said, certainty of death, small chance of success. What are we waiting for? So,
that's right.
And as the Spartans said, you want a glorious death. And so, don't be down. This is, even when you kind of realize maybe you're having that dark night of the soul, you are Frodo and you are Gollum and you are battling. It's great. Be thankful that you broke out of the norm and that you're able to experience these things, because this, the dark night of the soul is life.
Yeah. Death for the purpose of rebirth.
Yeah, do not miss it. And so you mentioned, Aragorn, the king, Strider, he had to go into the underworld, face death. And then he was able to not fall prey to the mouth of Sauron. And he cut his damn head off, which I thought was pretty badass personally. I know some people don't like that. They're like, well, that's not kingly. And I'm like, stop being a candy ass. Yes, it was. I mean, come on,
cut the head off that thing.
Yeah, it's like, what are you supposed to do? Bargain with it? No, that's not a good idea. We've all seen where that gets us. So don't do it. Don't bargain with the mouth of Sauron. Well, Galadriel, who definitely went on a similar journey to as Aragorn, if we can talk about that for a moment. But I've always loved her line when she banished Sauron, and you can probably say it more powerfully than I can.
Well, so the whole deal with Galadriel, I mean, she's 10,000 some odd years old. So Galadriel has had a lot of experience dealing with evil over all of that period of time. And so in the encounter with Sauron at Dol Guldur, Galadriel has no weapon. She does not have a sword or any other weapons. But what she has with her is the light Erendil. So she defeats Sauron with the light. And the light is the life force of the universe. So she holds up in that encounter. Well, first of all, Sauron comes in and tells her, he tries to run the same scam on her that Wormtongue ran on Éowyn. You are alone. Who knows what? Speak to the darkness in bitter watches of the night. So that's how Sauron and Wormtongue and the mouth of Sauron, that's how they get us. It's not only that you are alone, but that everybody is alone, and there will be no one coming to help you. There is no fellowship. There is no anything. The only option is to surrender to this predator, this force of evil. And Éowyn manages to wrest herself from the spell of Wormtongue, and then she goes on her heroine's journey, or her shero's journey. But Galadriel had been dealing with this whole business for 10,000 years. So she was able to enter his mind, but she was able to keep him from entering her mind. So this is very important. We need to know evil and the nature of evil, but we don't let it enter our being. We have to practice, observing and seeing, oh yeah, there it is, yes, it's this, doing this, and it's doing that. But we don't let it enter our own mind and our own being. And that's tricky. That's why it's so important to do the personal shadow work. Because if there is personal shadow undealt with in the unconscious, then it opens the door for archetypal evil to come in. So that's why the inner work is so important. So Galadriel, over all the millennia of her experience, had developed that ability to look into evil, but not let it come into her to the point that it destroyed her from the inside. So in that encounter, Sauron says, you're alone, and Galadriel says, oh no, I am not alone. And that's because she trusts the kingly men in the form of Elrond and Saruman, before he went bad, appeared and fought off the manifestation of the Nazgul there. And she holds up the light at Erendil and says, you have no power here, servant of Morgoth. You are nameless, faceless, formless. Go back to the void from which you came. So that is a powerful statement, and something that we can use in ourselves. And when we hear the toxic waste being spewed forth from the mainstream media and their minions, that's what we can practice saying in just to ourselves and to that stuff that comes at us. It has no power here in the whole self.
Also, I'm reminded of Irwin. Gosh, sorry, I get her names messed up. Arwen. Yes, Arwen. Yeah. Yes, Arwen. Yes, I like how he token, like, these names are so similar,
Yeah.
And so Arwen, I think also, I love her line that she says to Wormtongue when, I guess you could say, she passes her test. She says, your words are poison.
Oh, Right, that's Eowyn. That's
Eowyn, so
Eowyn.
yes,
Yeah,
Eowyn. Yeah, not Arwen. That's Arwen Evenstar. So
yeah,
no, but yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I
Your words
love
are poison.
that
That's right.
line to me. I think that is a great one when we find ourselves in despair, when things get to
Yes.
us. Your words are poison. I think that's it might be the most powerful line in Lord of the Rings, the movies. I
Yes.
think everyone has had to find that in themselves, or maybe not everyone, but some do, where you say, your words are poison.
Hmm.
You know,
And in that scene there with Wormtongue and Eowyn, it was so well done because it really depicted, you could see the change, like what's going on in Eowyn's face as he's, circling around her. Um, that she's struggling because he is giving voice to her deepest fears. Her deepest fear is that, yeah, I'm alone here. I'm stuck with this guy, and my brother has been banished. Her cousin uh, Theodred, who's Theoden's son, is dead. The king is possessed and weak, and her greatest fear is that, you know, I'm alone here, and all I have is this guy. And so you can see her just really struggling, because that's what happens on the inside when we've got the inner worm tongue. That it's that voice that speaks to us about our deepest fears, and tells us, you're alone, you're never going to, be free, you're never going to become anything, your life is a wasteland. uh, some version of that is going on somewhere in everyone. We all have one of those characters. So the task is to know that, and to differentiate that voice, so that when you hear that going on at some level, then that's when you can consciously turn around and say to that thing, your words are poison, because they are. But the problem is, most people who have not done inner work or therapy or psychological exploration don't even know they have that voice. They just feel depressed or enraged and don't know where it's coming from. It's just like, all of a sudden I'm depressed, or all of a sudden I'm enraged. And it's so important to make the connection that if you're in a powerful feeling state, that it comes from somewhere. And if you turn your attention within to find the source of that, you're going to find something like a worm tongue.
because worm tongue, when you look at I'll call it the mainstream media, but it's a darker thing than that. The mainstream media is only there's something
The
deep.
outer voice of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the outer voice. Ultimately, the mouth of Sauron was not Sauron. So
Right.
and when, let's see, well, I'm glad we're recording. I totally lost my train of thought.
Well, that's okay. We're on a lot of stuff here. We've got a lot of
Yeah.
balls in the air.
Yeah. Oh goodness. Well, I'll probably leave that in anyway. But what I will say is, worm tongue is like, so you have the mouth of Sauron, which is not ultimately Sauron. You have the mainstream media, which represents something even darker, of course, an evil force. Let's just say Sauron. The main Sauron media. Boom, there it is. Well, worm tongue is like a amazing amazing psychotherapist, like one of the best. But rather than somebody who is helping you, they're constantly saying, "Oh, you are nothing. Oh, you doubt yourself. Oh, you don't like your image." They just keep saying things until they find something. I found something. Okay, let's drill down on that. And so rather than that, they really are like if Frodo is the good psychotherapist, like Gollum is the bad one. like Wormtongue is the bad one. He's like the shadow psychotherapist. He's like shadow wisdom. You know, he just finds your weakness and just drills into it.
Yeah.
You know, rather than trying to help you, he goes, "Oh, I found a way to manipulate you." I mean, he is like the archetypal psychopath, really.
Yeah, and he's a servant of Saruman,
Yes.
the dark magician.
Yes. And so something I thought we could go into, because I think this is something that many people I know are facing right now, is that our friends and family are falling at this time. The battle is on.
Yeah.
It is going. It is happening. And I know it's very, very, hard for people. And I thought something we could maybe help ourselves with, is so right now it seems a time, since the battle is real, since the veil is broken and the battle of good and evil is happening on the earth at this time. The Uruk-hai are, everywhere. And so it is hard to look into the eye of Sauron. And so, like, Pippin did so, and he had his struggle and such. And then Aragorn, he holds the eye of Sauron and says,
Palantir.
The Palantir, thank you. The Palantir, and says, "You've hunted me for a long time, but now I'm coming after you,"
Yeah.
And so that is a difficult thing. And it's one of the things that, for me, seeing that evil, it changes one's life. And I think it takes, so for me, it was in my early 20s, like maybe, actually, I think I was 19 or so. And that's when I was in the military and I went to Somalia, and that's where I can say I saw evil. It touched me, and I received the wound of evil, you could say.
Yeah.
And so that's where you decide, are you going to go down that Tolkien path or that Gollum path? And I'm doing my best to stay on the Tolkien path, but there's more than one dark night of the soul in that, of course. And it is hard to look into the eye of Sauron and have seen that evil and go on. But there begins your quest. Maybe you're Frodo. I wish I'd never seen it, but you did.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
And so it seems that right now we've got those who are falling, who go, "I will not look into the eye of Sauron. I will just believe Wormtongue. I will be an Uruk-hai, basically. I will be a servant." So it seems like we're in this situation where you are either a servant to Sauron, basically, or you have looked into the eye of Sauron and you have said, "Your words are poison."
Yeah.
And it seems like we are literally, like, the earth is split in, I don't want to say in half, because it's not 50-50. It's 80% are servants of Sauron, and you have those who are finding themselves, doing the shadow work, and finding their fellowship.
That's right.
And so how can we, I know I just said quite a lot there, but still, what can we glean to, like, from Lord of the Rings, from this great, mythology, to, so I'm sure if you're listening to this, you've looked into the eye of Sauron, you've received your wound, you know what evil is, but now you have to keep going, and it can be you can feel very alone. Maybe while you're listening to this, you're in your own dark night of the soul to some extent, and you're going, "I will continue the Tolkien path. I will not go down the Gollum path. I do not want to be a servant." But yet, all around me, I am heartbroken because, you could say my family and my community, maybe a huge percent of the population, they've gone the other way. They don't have that courage to look into the eye of Sauron.
Yeah. Well, that's the truth. The members of the fellowship are few. Not everyone will be able to do this. And just like in Lord of the Rings, the hobbits, particularly, because the four hobbits take on that journey and that burden in order to keep the Shire. And the rest of the hobbits don't really know what's going on. And now I know there is a difference in the between the film version and the Tolkien's original version, where the Shire is scoured, and Saruman and his minions do come and invade the Shire. But I think that I like Peter Jackson's version of that, keeping the Shire from being scoured, because it symbolizes that part of life that is still protected, even though there's all these battles and everything going on, that there is something worth protecting. And so for those of us who are doing the inner work, who are dealing with shadow and suffering through this dark night of the soul, descent to the underworld, we do that in order to preserve the Shire. See, the Shire is an inner condition as well. I would see the Shire as the symbol of that inner place where we go to connect with the divine child, with the child part of the self that feels joy and awe and wonder and appreciates beauty and can be playful and fun-loving and unburdened by, the impinging, ever-present force of evil. And so for those of us who are called to this journey, we do it to preserve whatever is left of the Shire. And it's quite true that most of us, myself included, family members, friends who don't want to hear about any of this are like vehemently resistant to hearing anything about, the so-called bad things that are going on. They want to believe that, it's not that bad, and our government cares about us, and, Billions Gates loves us, and, he's such a philanthropist, he's going to take care of everything and vaccinate everybody in the world, and it's because he's so loving and kind. So it's that just extreme innocence that cannot be broken through with presenting information. I mean, I'm sure you've tried it, Craig. I know I've tried it many times, thinking, okay, they just don't understand what's going on. So I'm going to, give them all this information. And, I did a whole 10, 11 hour video series unpacking the whole thing. But some people just will not go there. They will not go there.
It takes courage. That's the thing. It's not everyone is ready to look into the eye of Sauron and then have that wound. Because for me, I guess you could say that situation befell me. I was ready for it, and I guess it can happen in any way, in many, many ways, of course. But that to me happened in Somalia, and that was a great challenge. And I went, and even when it initially happened, I didn't even know. It took, maybe years to understand it. And so, and then to really begin working with it. And I think that a great kind of modern day philosopher, Neil Kramer, said, I know Kramer's work. Yes, Neil Kramer. He said, people wake up when it's time. It's their schedule. They wake up when it's time. It's just
when you're called.
Yes.
This falls into the realm of fate and destiny. Fate and destiny is not an experience that happens to you from the outside, but rather is something innate within you that occurs, and it's called out of you from the inside based on whatever it is you're experiencing. So, your time in Somalia, I would say that there was something in your soul that moved you along the path to put you there. And in that encounter, you met that foe, and you then have done your inner work to deal with that. You probably know many who may have been with you there who did not do that, who shut it all down and went into suicide or addiction or just complete and total denial. But if you're part of your personal calling is to deal with something like that, then you must rise to your greatness there and do what needs to be done.
Yes, and I love that when fate smiles on destiny. It really is it's something that comes from within you. It may seem that it happened to you, yes, but it did not. And when it comes to those who are dealing with friends and family falling to being the Uruk-hai, basically, servants of Sauron. Something that Samwise Gamgee said when Frodo was having a moment of despair, definitely, he said, and I forget the exact quote, but, why are we going on? And Sam says, because there's still goodness in the world worth fighting for.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And how we realize that can be very, very difficult. And something that it brings to mind is, while we're in this battle, not to lose compassion,
Yes.
because I think that, for me, I can say one of my, Somalia experiences, that's one thing about having a podcast like this, is that you have to be honest, authentic. And one of the things for me was not so much hardness, but softness that was kind of an entry for me when I saw evil. So I realized there was evil there, and I saw it in people's eyes, and I saw the desperation. I saw it, and I went, wow, this is heavy stuff, and this is real. And so whenever somebody is a little too new agey and says, oh, there's no good or evil, I'm like, bullshit. Straight up, you can take that and find a short beer and take a long walk, because yes, there is. And what that means is that you've never seen it.
Yeah.
When you've seen it, you'll know it's real. And I think for me, which was not losing compassion, because one thing that happened to me in Somalia was we were out in the field, kind of patrolling around, making sure no one was getting a drop on us. You have to go out there and defend your forward defensive battery and such like that, and make sure nobody's sneaking in mortars or snipers or getting in there. And a young kid ran up and knocked me over the head with a cinder block. I mean, totally knocked me on my ass. And what he wanted to do, they try to grab your rifle, is what they want, right. And they also like sunglasses. Anyway, so I held on to my rifle, and he grabbed my sunglasses, and off he ran. And I hopped up quickly, and, I aimed my rifle at him, and I could have shot him down, and I was pissed, and it was a not good situation, and I'd have totally gotten away with it. Nobody would have cared. Everyone would have been like, nah, didn't see it, but I didn't.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
And that was a defining moment in my life. I was like, no, no, won't do it, and so I think that it's important to not let the ring consume us, this burden that we may carry, having seen evil, because I think about compassion, and Bilbo spared Gollum, and that was an essential aspect of the books, of what was to come. And then also Aragorn, Strider, the king, he spared Grima Wormtongue. He spared Wormtongue. And we ask ourselves sometimes, would we have spared them? Oh, and I think that in you, what would have spared them is your greatness. It really is, It's like when everyone, at the end of Lord of the Rings, when everyone bows, and then the hobbits bow, and the king says, you bow to no one.
That's right.
It's finding that in yourself. And so, and Aragorn ultimately that to me, that last moment in, Lord of the Rings, in the movies, of course that's not necessarily in the books, but he, you bow to no one. That has got this just deep meaning that I think it always has really grabbed me. I went, yeah, now there's the king. That,
Yeah.
I didn't even understand it completely yet, but I maybe I will more in time. But man, that really, I went, that's a powerful moment for me. That means something.
Sure is. Well, and it is a manifestation of kingship in the sense of how we claim our own power in our own life, to be the kings and queens of our own life. If you are a mature man or woman, i.e. king or queen, you don't need the adoration of other people. You don't need people bowing and scraping and telling you how great you are. So that scene that you're describing is that a true leader and one who could be a leader in the larger world is not someone who demands the adoration of others, that he's confident enough in himself to know that he didn't do it on his own. And there's another thing, Craig, when you were telling your story about Somalia, I was reminded of the scene in the caves of Moria, where Gollum first appears, and Gandalf is
Yes.
saying to Frodo, he's been following us for 3 days. And Frodo goes, "What? Oh no, Bilbo should have killed him. Bilbo should have killed him when he had the chance." And Gandalf says, "Oh, really? Don't be so quick to deal in death and judgment. Who are you to decide, Frodo?" And that's a pretty profound little scene there, because Frodo, that's his first real awakening to what's really going on. That you don't just run around trying to kill people to get rid of evil. It's way bigger than that.
Yes. It's definitely a battle, but we have to keep that sense of compassion, Definitely, yeah. Bilbo spared Gollum and Aragorn spared, Grima Wormtongue. He did not spare the mouth of Sauron. I'm fine with that. And so it's very true. It seems like in that battle, a bit of how we, keep from falling into despair is to have a sense of empathy. Just like Gandalf had for Gollum, is that you realize that as you see your friends and your family, as you see them kind of falling to the eye of Sauron, to the mouth of Sauron, there's this needed, I have found, for me, there is this needed compassion just to realize that, well, for one thing, okay, so let's say that that's the case. They fall for it. Well, what about your fellowship and what about your mission? Ultimately, the fellowship is always small. So the fellowship was only 9, and so it seems like you go through your own initiation. You've seen the Eye of Sauron. Also, you have realized your bone marrow, your depths. You're beginning to study your shadow and work with that, and then you are on your own, kingship or queenship, that quest within yourself, and so you're doing it. And I would say, when it comes to fellowship, you have your own personal initiation, then you can find your fellowship. So first you got to be doing your work before the fellowship comes along. And so if a person does not have that at this time, they're only surrounded by people who are, falling, basically. Make a concerted effort towards your own initiation, and then realize that if you have a fellowship at all, it will be small.
And it will come together in an unusual way. Just like in Lord of the Rings. I mean, how did they all come together? It was unusual. It wasn't like a big long plan of, okay, we're going to get together with so-and-so and, create the army and all of that. No, they came together out of their different realms of experience in a way that was unusual. And I think that's how it's happening right now. The fellowship, as I call it, is growing and coming together. I have more hope now than I ever did when I first started doing this work and really diving in, especially into evil. And I thought, wow, if this is what's happening, where is the fellowship? Are there other people out there who see this, who understand this? And lo and behold, it's people like you, Craig, other people, David Whitehead, Michael Tsarian, these people who've been around for a long time speaking the truth and bringing the truth and wisdom to the forefront and drawing in those who are capable of joining the fellowship, who already have an inkling that evil is afoot in the world. And we need to name it and stand up to it. And then from there, we develop the compassion for those who are orcified. I call it orcification. So what happens to people who can't stand to face evil and say your words are poison, they become orcified, but not all of them are bad. Orcification, what that looks like in sort of day-to-day life is people who just follow orders, who just do what they're told, go do this, oh, okay, and don't question the so-called authority that tells them to do this, that, or the other thing. They obey, they follow the herd, and either don't want to or aren't able to think about it any further. And Tolkien wrote about this in through his experiences in World War I, that most of the people on no matter what side, on both sides, all these young men are sent out to kill each other in this most horrific way, and they're just obeying orders. No one really wanted to do it. It's all being driven from the Eye of Sauron at the top of the pyramid, getting people to do his bidding and, sending out the armies of these young men, cannon fodder, to do stuff that they really didn't want to do. So orcification is the order followers, those who just do as they're told and don't question whether it's bad or evil or destructive. It's just, well, this is my job. I'm doing my job. And we know where we've heard that before. I was just doing my job. It's not my fault.
Oh, yeah.
And that's orcification. So for the ones who are able to take a step back and ask the question, like, whoa, do I really want to do this? Perform this task, or go off to kill people on the other side of the world, or to be the one who gives the vaccination. They don't know anything about it. They don't know what's in it. But there's somebody told them, this is what you got to do. You got to go out and, vaccinate however many people. It's the inability to question orders that come from higher up, whatever that means. And if we follow that, the trail to the higher ups that give the orders, well, then you start to see where the power really lies. And I would see that as the, equivalent of the Eye of Sauron. The so-called people who own and operate the world and design all these wars and all this stuff that's going on, they are few. There is not that many at the top of the pyramid. And probably most of them, we don't even know their names. And what information we do get comes primarily from whistleblowers, people who have been on the inside and who somehow survive and come out to tell the tale. This is where our information is coming from. It's coming from people who have looked into the Eye of Sauron and maybe have served the dark side and realized what was going on, and then came out to reveal some of the truth. But not everyone is going to have the capacity even to question, and even if they do question, to take the labyrinthine journey that you and I have taken, Craig, to really drill down into all of this and spend the years and years of study and research to try to put all of this together, to find a way out, to find a way to bring forth our own greatness and do something in the world that we feel will contribute to the light. But that's not going to be everyone. So perhaps where we need to really go now as a fellowship is to build community and try to lay some foundation, even though a lot of us we're spread all over the world. And so maybe the next step is, how do we build community, build small fellowship where we are to carry on the work.
And it is happening. And the fellowship now, it's international. And as you were speaking, I was kind of just making a little note. I mentioned it seems like you've got the Eye of Sauron, then you have that speaking through the Orcified, who basically, it's usually a programming that comes from authority. It's usually fear-based programming from authority that, fear is used to program. And then they just spread that malice, you know, and so that tends to be, I think, the hierarchy of it. And yes, our international fellowship, it's coming together, and I think we really have to hold true. And it can be hard at times that, Samwise Gamgee was very right. Why do the heroes keep going even when they wanted to turn back, even when it didn't seem like there was any hope? Just because you believe, there's still goodness in this world, and it's worth fighting for. And I think for those that have seen the Eye of Sauron, have experienced that, and really you can see it in your own shadow work. If one does that, you'll find it there. Guarantee it. It's there. I see you. You'll find it if you haven't already. And with that said, that once you've seen it, it's almost like how all the females, so many of them, the queens, they died of grief in the book.
Yes,
in the books,
all the mothers die of grief.
Yeah, you will die of grief from your wound if you don't use it to create. So really, if you're listening to this, you probably have no choice. You got to do it. And what you were mentioning about just following orders, well, I think about the masks everybody's wearing, and I'm just going to call it these ridiculous masks that everybody's wearing. I saw a great one that said, "This is a mind control device" on it.
Oh, really? Oh, that's great.
And I was like, yes. Oh, my gosh.
Use the enemy's tools against it.
I'm like, that is great, And it reminds me of Star Wars, of course, the stormtroopers. Cover your face, as Joseph Campbell put it. There is your corporate employee. There is your individual who's never lived a day doing what they wanted to in their whole life. And so you cover your face. We're wearing the masks. We're now stormtroopers, And it also reminded me, what you're saying is a line by Robert Anton Wilson. He says, and I've always liked this, it's kind of a badass line. It's kind of like Eowyn saying, "Your words are poison." He said, "The obedient always think of themselves as virtuous rather than cowardly."
Yeah.
Take
Mhm.
that. Maybe I'll write that on a mask. I'm not that I'm wearing one, but the obedient always think of themselves as virtuous rather than cowardly. Make masks that say that on them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it comes back to that compassion again. That the orcified, um, well, their humanity is destroyed. If you're orcified and you're in bondage to serving um, uh, the Eye of Sauron by your obedience, then your soul is sucked out of you. You don't have a life anymore, really. You're just doing what you're told, and you have to kill off a part of yourself to do that. So having compassion for those who are orcified is important, but at the same time, if we, have people around us who are in that state, we have to be protective of ourselves too. That having compassion and empathy does not mean that you run around rescuing people and sacrificing your own life force to, rescue or try to convince those who are not capable or who are so terrified of defying the ruling order that they can't hear any of the truth. So compassion is this is a word that is used a lot, compassion and empathy, and it's laid out like if you're not just gushing with some kind of savior complex, then you're not a good person.
Oh
So it's
yeah, and
being able to
being a doormat will only
master
get you
that.
walked on. Yes.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah, and that to me, I look at that being very new agey, you could call it, um, and not that I'm not kind of new age too. I mean, I live near Sedona, and I love all the craziness, but there is that point of doormattiness, that softness, that well, also there is that notion I think rooted in new age thought that is. You have to wake people up, and that we can't. It's almost like there's this notion that I cannot be happy until the world is enlightened. And it's like, well, okay, you're never going to be happy because it won't.
That's right.
So if
Yeah,
that's what you want, cool. I'm just saying it
it's
won't work.
idealism. It's that the new age thing was really just this outrageous, over the top idealism, and it's very infantile. That let's all just be friends, and why can't we just get along and everybody hold hands and sing kumbaya, and then everything will be great and there'll be no more conflict in the world. I mean, that is just naive. And it's the necessity of the hero's journey is the loss of innocence. You must lose your innocence. It's part of growing up, and it's certainly part of the initiation into adulthood, that we don't have initiation rituals or rites anymore that are meaningful. I mean, in ancient cultures and tribal cultures, they all had initiation rituals that marked that transition for a child into adulthood. It's like you, as a child, knew that after you undergo this initiation, your childlike innocence is gone. And it doesn't mean, that you have to face evil, but it does mean that you have to face the reality of the fact that we don't live in a little happy paradise world where everybody can hold hands and be one. That's infantile. So I think a lot of this is an issue that comes from not having significant initiation rites for men and women. And so the culture at large remains in this state of childlike innocence, and naivete that leaves them just like babies and easily manipulated, especially by the mainstream media mouth of Sauron BS that is spouted constantly.
Absolutely. And well, one thing I wanted to touch on before we wrapped up, because I've had you for just over 2 hours now, is we were going to talk about being a strong man and a strong woman, being a strong king, being a strong woman, and of course, your male has the inner anima, and the female has the inner animus. But we've already done our 2 hours, but I wanted to touch on that really briefly and just say, well, for people who'd like to get into being their own, powerful queen, their own powerful king, definitely you can go to Loralee's site and check out the arrow and sword section, watch that, and there's much in there for you. But then also, there's a work you did with David Whitehead. I'll link to that in the show notes.
Great.
And of course, for men, I would say, you know what, Iron John, great book to read. Also, there's a version on YouTube, which is I think Robert Ply going through the story, and I'll link to that. It's very good if you want to listen to that. And of course for men, there's a King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, Rediscovering the Archetypes of the Mature Masculine. Short book, easy to read through, really powerful. You will find yourself and others that you know in that book for sure, especially the High Chair Tyrant. And
yes.
With that, also I'll link to, there is not an audible version, but that was recorded on tape ages ago, and now you really can't find the tapes anymore, but someone did put them on YouTube, and so I'll link to that if you want to listen. But what I would ask Loralee before we wrap up is, what are good books and things that women can listen to get into to understand their basically their queenly quest that they are on?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say if for anyone who wants to really go down into the deeper depth psychology part of all of this, the book for men, actually 2 books that I would recommend in addition to the ones you've mentioned, especially Robert Moore's King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which the book you're describing is the kind of the short version, but Moore wrote entire volumes on each archetype. So there's 4 thick volumes on each archetype of the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. So I would certainly recommend that. And I would suggest for men and women to read both, right? So for women to read this material about male psychology, and for men to read the material about female psychology, because we have the opposite within us, what Jung called the contrasexual. So within every man is the feminine principle, and within every woman is the masculine principle that undergoes the same hero-shiro journey. So if you have a broader understanding of the opposite. So if you're a man, if you have a broader understanding of female psychology, then that's going to help you deal with your inner feminine. And if you're a woman and you have a broader understanding of masculine psychology, then you're going to understand your inner animus, your inner masculine, in a better way. So and books that I do recommend in my series for men, there's 2 books by Eugene Monnick. One is called Castration and Male Rage, and the other is called Phallos, Sacred Image of the Masculine. And then for women, the primary book is actually an elaboration on the myth of Inanna and Ereshkigal that I mentioned earlier. And that book is called The Descent to the Goddess, A Way of Female Initiation. And then I would also recommend, for both men and women, 2 books by Jean Shinoda Bolen. one called Goddesses in Every Woman, and the other Gods in Every Man. And in those books, she delineates the primary gods and goddesses of Greek mythology, and looks at each one as a facet of the male or female. And they're easy to read. They're very, because they're using mythic archetypes, you'll find similar qualities in the characters in Lord of the Rings. Because Tolkien obviously is drawing from the mythology of the West, all over. And what we're most familiar with, I think, just most of us had read mythology or were taught mythology in school, not a whole lot, not real deep, but at least learned about the gods and goddesses, right? So there's some good material right there to help people start looking into this and watching and feeling into when these are activated in your own imaginal world. Sometimes in your dreams, you'll have characters that manifest particular qualities that then can be found in the myths. So I would recommend looking into that and paying close attention to your own personal dreams. And if you do pay attention to your dreams, and it's always a good idea to write them down, have a dream journal. You don't have to write down every single dream that you have, but periodically people will have big dreams, and what Jung called a dream of your mythos. And it's those big dreams that you want to grab a hold of and write down and dialogue with. Talk to the characters that appear in your dreams, because your dreams are your own personal myth being played out and told to you in your during your sleep. Your own personal story is being rolled out like a movie, right in your own self. So dreams are really important, and important for this reason, that they let you know what energies, what archetypal energies are being activated and presenting themselves to consciousness. So dream work is very important. And the more you understand your own dreams and pay attention to the workings of that domain, then you'll be able to understand and observe and really see how myth is playing itself out in the outer world. And it just gives us a whole other dimension of capacity and ability to deal with what we see in the outer world, if we have a sense of how it works on the inside.
100%. And how you mentioned dreams, and all the books you mentioned, I will link to in the show notes to make it easier for people to find.
Right.
And in your series, you do mention some of those books also, of course.
Yeah.
And you mentioned dreams, and I have to just real quickly throw in that a dream I had shortly before I heard you on David Whitehead was there's a place that I walk, and if I walk there in the evenings, I kind of am up on this hill and I can see down there's some apartments, and if I look, not that I'm spying on people, but all their apartments like open these big windows, and you can see everyone's watching CNN.
Yeah.
Everyone's watching the media, and I go, my gosh, all of this civilization, humanity, all of this, and here we are in the evenings, rich and poor, all together, watching CNN. We've accomplished so much. Well, anyway, so I was looking at that, and I thought, wow. So there is the main Sauron media, cymatic. Everybody's getting atoned with
trance.
it in a trance.
Yeah,
yes. And then so I had this waking dream. Maybe I was astral projecting. I could have been, but it was waking dream, very, very lucid. And I was walking that same path, and it was 3:00 in the morning. That was very vivid. It was 3:00 in the morning. That's a magic time. 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm looking and I see all the TVs on, but they're not quite as bright. And I thought, my heavens, everybody's watching. Everyone's up late tonight. Maybe they went to sleep, left them on. I don't know. Well, then I realized, no, it was them broadcasting.
Yeah.
The people, as they slept, were broadcasting the same cymatic that they had atoned with. And so our dreams are, yes, very powerful. And one thing, since we have talked about, kings a lot, they get a lot of, play there in Lord of the Rings. And people often ask, wow, why are initiations into manhood so, extreme? And I've always answered, because men are kind of bricks, It takes a lot for us to get it. But something I wanted to touch on right before we left, I've had you a little bit over time, but I wanted to mention, since we have talked a lot about, Aragorn and the male side of things, Galadriel. She is the one character who actually held the ring in her hand and felt into it, like you said, felt into it. And she
actually she didn't hold it in her hand.
No,
she was reaching for it.
She was reaching for it. Okay, so it was given to her. She said, "You give it to me freely."
Give it to me freely.
So she didn't touch it, but she then she becomes the dark Galadriel, and she says, "All will love me and despair," but she didn't take it. And I think she's the one character. So sometimes it may seem that the Lord of the Rings leans a little bit towards the masculine side, and that's cool. But do you realize that you might be overlooking the power of that moment, that Galadriel, she passed her test?
Yeah, and I drilled down into that quite deeply in my section on queenship and the feminine. But one of the reasons that there's not a lot of female characters in this story is because, number one, Tolkien was a 20th century man, and his books were published, I think it was 1953. So he had not had the benefit of the knowledge of female psychology that has come forth since that time. So just the fact that he was a man, he's writing a hero's journey story. The female characters are few. I mean, there's really only 3, and their particular development is not a lot of time is spent on there, but there's a lot in, kind of hidden just in those characters. And one of the things that I focus on is the maiden mother crone archetype that is ancient. And this addresses some of the process of female psychology. I mean, women are bound to their bodies in a way that men aren't. So it's a different, the Shiro's journey is a different experience. And just to touch in on your point about male initiation and what it is for a man to go on the hero's journey, it's a different kind of experience because men are different than women. I mean, it's very strange that we're all being told now that men and women are interchangeable. And in fact, hey, you can even just change your gender if you want, apparently. But that is not the way it works in the psyche. Men are different physically, men are different psychologically, and men need the challenge of that hero's journey, the rough and tumble kind of activity that is a part of the male, the life of a male. Whereas women, their process is more about the changes that take place in the physical body. That is the initiation or the turning points of initiation for women. The maiden is the young girl who, when she begins her first period, her first menses, that is the end of childhood, like it or not. and the initiation into becoming an adult woman with the responsibility of potential childbearing and of taking care of the body, and having to attend to the body in a very real and physical way every single month. So that is a very different life experience.
And something that I've heard you mention before is that there's the first menstrual cycle is the initiation into into being a woman, for a woman, a female. Also, when they go into menopause, you mentioned that. So it's like the goddess gives them the ability to give life when they are young, and then gives them the ability to give wisdom when they get older.
Give birth to wisdom.
Give birth to wisdom. Oh, and that is so beautiful, and I think that is so meaningful. And yes, our initiation is always quite extreme in some cultures. Some it is not. Some it's just, I don't like jumping in a pit of biting ants, and then sometimes it's like the buffalo dance, which anybody who wants to study that, talk about extreme. Like, how many of us would willfully do that now? Oh my gosh. So, it's definitely a bit extreme for the guys at times. Well, with it being somewhat male-centric, yes, Lord of the Rings, I do think that I appreciate that on a certain level, because I've always felt that I think men understand men best, and I think women understand women best. It does not mean that they cannot understand each other very, very well, but there's a certain mystery, a certain veil.
There is.
If you're born with a male body, then you are male. If you're born with a female body, you are female. I like something you said once, either male, female, or an orc. Well, it's true. So, so basically, Tolkien wrote, and I think it's so powerful, about what he knew. And that's why he really nailed it, because he wrote mostly about the male psyche, because that's what he knew. I've always been slightly frustrated by men who write books about women's psyche and then women who write books about the male psyche. I've always been like, you can't know. You know what I mean? I mean,
true.
There's so much we can know, but there's a certain mystery that we cannot know. And so I think it's one of the things.
We honor the mystery. We have to honor the mystery.
Gotta honor the mystery. Absolutely honor the mystery. Embrace the mystery, because that's love. That is the beauty of that relationship, that coming together where, as Joseph Campbell put, in a real beautiful marriage, you are the center of the same wheel.
Yeah.
And you have to embrace that. You have to embrace that mystery. So be thankful that you don't know everything, because you can't, and that's part of the beautiful duality of our planet, Well, thank you, Loralee, so much for being on Radiant Creators. Everybody, I'll have links to all this stuff in the show notes. It has been so great having you on the show. I really hope that we, achieve the intent that we had in helping people, better deal with the battle of our time. So it's Loralee Scaife, or your last name. Scaife, yes, Loralee Scaife, and LLastrology-LOTR.com. Thank you so much, Loralee, for being on the show.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, and thank you for all your work.
Oh, and thank you for yours. And, I'll send you a link when we get this up. And thank you so much for being on the show. And just thank you. I think this was great. This was important, and I'm glad that we got it out there. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You are listening to Radiant Creators, a collaborative project composed of people whose passion, purpose, and dedication requires forging their own unique path of empowerment and livelihood. A radiant creator isn't making a living, they are living.